Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Early Childhood Colorado Partnership Lunch and Learn for February. Today we'll be talking about preschool suspension and expulsion. And before we jump in, just want to provide a little bit of background on the Early Childhood Colorado Partnership and our Lunch and Learn process, since I know a lot of people registered looked very new to the partnership or haven't participated in the partnership efforts before. So the partnership is a statewide network of early childhood professionals from across the state, from state and local agencies, nonprofits, early childhood councils, foundations, universities, business community, and beyond, committed to advancing the vision of the Early Childhood Colorado framework statewide. The vision for the partnership is that all Colorado children are valued, healthy, and thriving, and the partnership really brings people to the table to identify shared results and move best practices forward, and also provide different types of professional development and training and shared learning, like our Lunch and Learn webinars. And every month we host a different webinar focused on a different topic. And this month's topic is especially salient, it sounded like, as we had over 100 people register for the webinar. So super excited to jump in. A couple of just small housekeeping things. We, with so many participants, we keep participants muted during the webinar. If you have questions, we'll provide some time for questions during and after the webinar. But if you do have a question in the middle, you can kind of use the little question option or the chat box in your GoToWebinar dashboard on the right side, and share your question or your thought, and we'll field it as we can. And we'll save a few minutes at the end for questions, hopefully, as well. Any previous Lunch and Learns, all Lunch and Learns are recorded. You can find them, previous recordings, and then this recording will be posted shortly on the Early Childhood Colorado Partnership website. You can see that link at the bottom of this slide. And we'll also be sharing the slides in a follow-up email as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters. We have, pardon me, just a moment, I have a glitch with the technology, so wrong PowerPoint here. Somehow the wrong PowerPoint got put up there. Yes. So as I'm switching up our technology here, I'm going to have our presenters just go ahead and introduce themselves instead of me introducing them, so we can save a couple minutes. So go ahead. Apologies.
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Davidon. We wanted to make things extra confusing for you by having two Sarahs present today. So we'll try and say this is Sarah D or this is Sarah B. So I'm Sarah Davidon, and I am the Director of Policy, Community Outreach, and Education at JFK Partners, which is Colorado's University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, located at the University of Colorado Medical School, and I'm in the Department of Pediatrics. I've been involved for a number of years in Colorado on issues regarding suspension and expulsion, and was involved in a couple of studies in 2006 and 2011. To look at expulsion and suspension in young children.
And I am Sarah Barnes. I'm the policy analyst at the Colorado Children's Campaign, and I'm really excited to be joining Sarah D here today to present on this issue. The Children's Campaign has been working on this issue with a number of partners from policy standpoint recently, and so I'm excited to be here today as well.
We are back on with all the correct PowerPoint slides, so we are good to go. Thanks to everybody for being patient.
So we wanted to start just by sort of putting this in the context of school discipline and sort of how we've moved away a little bit from what discipline originally meant, and that we, I think, need to consider this as we talk about things like suspension and expulsion, and also other kinds of discipline practices. So discipline is supposed to mean, it comes from the root disciple, referring to a follower, a believer of a teacher. But we know that it's kind of taken a detour from its root. So discipline now has a lot of times become a practice that includes punitive measures, including exclusion and isolation from peers, either temporarily or permanently. We're fortunate that practices such as what you see here in this slide which happened in Kentucky, where an 8-year-old boy was handcuffed by the police who were called in by the school. We're fortunate that we're not seeing this in Colorado. However, we are seeing suspensions and expulsions. So as I said, you probably heard about this case in Kentucky. I think this was last year. A boy with ADHD was handcuffed, and the deputy who had been called in told him that once he stopped misbehaving, the deputy would take off the handcuffs, as if it were that easy for an 8-year-old boy to just stop misbehaving. I did want to mention, too, that as we're thinking about the context, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into some of the data, that students with disabilities make up about 12% of public school student bodies, yet about 75% of students who are physically restrained, like this boy is in this picture, have disabilities, according to the U.S. Department of Education. So I think as we're considering the topic of suspensions and expulsions, we need to think about and Sarah B. will go into this a little bit more around the data, but we need to think about the kinds of groups of people who perhaps we're seeing some disproportionality, as well as the issues of restraint and seclusion as also potentially being used as discipline practices, whereas that's sort of not the intent of those kinds of practices. Hopefully many of you have also seen that there's been some positive press about the issues. The New York Times, local education news, national periodicals have brought attention to practices, policies, and strategies that have demonstrated success and that we know can help guide states and municipalities toward addressing some of the core issues. And we finally see this as a national priority. There have been states and some research that's been looking at this for over 10 years now, and that we have over a decade of emerging data and anecdotal evidence indicating that very young children are being excluded from early childhood settings. But in 2014 was when a policy statement was released from the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services and Education to support families, early childhood programs, and states by providing recommendations for preventing and severely limiting the use of expulsion and suspension practices in early childhood settings. In July of 2015, the Departments of Education and Justice hosted teams of educators for an initiative called Rethink Discipline, which some of you might have heard of. It was a day-long conference at the White House on creating positive school climate and implementing effective discipline practices. And the conference sought to advance the national conversation about reducing the overuse of unnecessary out-of-school suspension or expulsions and replacing these practices with positive alternatives to make sure that kids are staying in school and engaged in their learning. So the White House Rethink Discipline Conference built on the work of several other initiatives. So the President's My Brother's Keeper initiative, the White House Council on Women and Girls, and the Supportive School Discipline Initiative, which is a collaboration between the U.S. Departments of Ed and Justice. And it was launched in 2011 to support the use of school discipline practices that foster safe, supportive, and productive learning environments while keeping kids in school. So I think that's important to think about that. At the federal level, the U.S. Departments of Education as well as Justice are really sort of understanding the need to not preclude schools from being able to sort of use their judgment around discipline practices, but ensuring that those practices foster safe, supportive, and productive learning environments while kids stay in school. Last year's specific data focus by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, which we'll talk about a little bit later, on early childhood education, it highlighted significant issues of suspension and expulsion, including disparate impact of suspension and expulsion practices on certain populations. So we might be thinking about the terms expulsion and suspension in different ways. So I just wanted to present some short definitions here so that as we talk more about suspension and expulsion, we're all thinking about the same definition for this. In an early childhood context, the issue of suspension might be a little less clear. So the kinds of things that we could maybe think about when we think about sort of what does suspension look like for a 4-year-old who's in an early learning center. It could be that at noon, the 4-year-old parent gets a call from the teacher saying, he hit somebody, he hit the teacher, you got to pick him up. Maybe he can come back tomorrow, let's talk later, but you got to come pick him up. So that could be a suspension where it's essentially you get a call as a parent and you got to go pick up the kid, and sometimes they can't go back the next day, sometimes they can, you never quite know, and it's pretty disruptive to parents, especially working parents. So a few things that we need to consider as we engage in the conversation about how we mitigate suspensions and expulsions. So some considerations as we go through this to think about. We need to make sure that as we're trying to reduce suspensions and expulsions, that we really need to make sure that resources are available and evidence-based strategies are available for teachers to employ and for school administrators to employ. Because if we're expecting that suspensions and expulsions are going to be limited in some way, we have to ensure it's our responsibility to make sure that teachers and administrators have the resources they need to have school-based strategies that they can employ. We also need to ensure that things like other kinds of disciplinary practices like restraint and seclusion are not being used as acceptable alternate forms of discipline. And also thinking that making sure that we're sort of understanding the differences between young children and older children in terms of the kinds of guidance and discipline practices that young children need and how their brains are developing. So there was a July 2015 study that was published in the American Journal of Public Health, and it found, I think this is something anecdotally that probably everybody on this webinar knows, but it's always nice to have some backup to it. There's a statistically significant association between measured social emotional skills in kindergarten and key young adult outcomes like education, employment, substance use, mental health. So it's really critical that we pay attention to the essential impact that we have as people who work with young children on the long-term outcomes of children by providing opportunities for social emotional skills development and for experiences that allow learning of these skills and strategies. And very often for many young children, that happens primarily in schools. They're spending a lot of their time in schools or in early learning environments. And so very often that is a key place for young children to master these skills. So what we want to focus on today are three areas. We want to look at the data and scope of the issues around suspension and expulsion, looking at what works, and then looking at what's needed. While Colorado does have the 2012 school discipline bill that essentially got rid of zero tolerance policies and allowed school discretion in managing situations that otherwise would have fallen under a zero tolerance policy, the guidance for the school discipline bill suggested promotion of alternatives to discipline to decrease out-of-school suspensions and expulsion, and stated that ZTPs, so zero tolerance policies to address discipline problems, often result in unnecessary suspension and expulsion. So I think even in 2012, Colorado was at the forefront of the recognition that zero tolerance policies don't work for many kids, and they usually don't accomplish the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish around changing behavior and making sort of safer and healthier schools. So for the data and scope, what we're going to be talking about is sort of what do we know about preschool and early childhood suspension and expulsion. Many of you are familiar with Walter Gilliam's 2005 study on public preschool expulsion. In Colorado, we were one of the first states in 2006 to do our own state study on the issue. So our Colorado study actually served as a model within the state of Colorado for local studies. So local communities then undertook doing their own county or local studies on suspension and expulsion. We want to talk about what works. So the field does have successful strategies and models to support kids and teachers. We know what to do, but we need to figure out ways to get these things built in and embedded into our early childhood system in a sustainable way. So there are various strategy levels from program curricula to public policies, and early childhood programs have and already are implementing best and evidence-based practices to teach social emotional skills and support teachers and other caregivers to respond when there are challenging behaviors that end up becoming very disruptive to classrooms. So states and municipalities have also done things such as pass legislation related to expulsion and suspension. And then the third area that we're going to cover today is what's needed. So there are key things that need to be addressed in order to have the information that the public will in order to resolve issues that contribute to suspension and expulsion. These don't simply address children's social and emotional skill building, but also the adult interpretation and responses to children's behavior. So we need to make sure that adults learn and have sort of the appropriate tools and skills that they need to respond, just as much as young children in their care need to have the appropriate behavior and tools and skills in their toolbox to respond.
All right, so we're going to start by looking at some data and starting out on the national level. In 2011, 2012, we have a civil rights data collection, which was the first ever collection of preschool suspension and expulsion data, and it showed out-of-school suspensions in preschool are racially disproportionate. So we see that Black students represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but they represent 42% of preschool students who are suspended once and 48% of preschool students who are suspended more than once. We also have some national data on trends with students with disabilities. And looking at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights data from 2014, we see that students with disabilities, so students served by IDEA, represent 12% of the student population, but they represent 58% of students who are placed in seclusion or involuntary confinement of some kind, and they represent 75% of those students who are physically restrained at school to immobilize them or reduce their ability to move freely in some way. We also see that students with disabilities are more than twice as likely on a national level to receive an out-of-school suspension than students without a disability. And then if we overlay the race and ethnicity lens to students with disabilities, we also see that, except in the case of Latino and Asian students, more than 1 out of 4 boys of color with disabilities and nearly 1 out of 5 girls of color with disabilities receive an out-of-school suspension. We also see on a federal level that about 52,000 children with disabilities each year are subjected to physical restraint with mechanical restraint such as handcuffs used in almost 4,000 of those cases. And while there are instances in which safety might demand that restraint be used or that a child be temporarily removed from an early learning setting, the data and anecdotal evidence tell a story of restraint, suspension, and expulsion that are being used far more frequently than when serious safety concerns are expressed.
One clarifying question from somebody, are these all preschool students, or does it include K-12 and preschool, this data?
So the previous slides were pulled out from the OCR's preschool data because the Office for Civil Rights was able to pull it out by age group.
Okay, so this is specifically preschool.
The one we're looking at now, the 52,500 is not preschool. So this slide we're looking at now is all students with disabilities that were included in the previous slide. The previous ones were preschool.
Okay, thanks to Jennifer for the question.
And then we also see, additionally for students with disabilities, a Maryland study in 2011 that indicated that a large percentage of young children exited their early childhood program because of behavioral problems, and these children had diagnosed developmental disabilities. So the joint policy statement we mentioned earlier states that a suspension and expulsion practices might also delay or interfere with the process of identifying and addressing underlying issues, which might include disabilities or mental health issues. And some of these children may have undiagnosed disabilities or behavioral health issues, and they may be eligible for additional services. But if those children are simply expelled, they may not receive evaluations or referrals that they need to obtain those services. For example, the source of a challenging behavior might be communication or language difficulties, which are skills that could be improved through early assessment and intervention services. And in these cases, appropriate evaluation and follow-up services are critical. But it's less likely that these will happen if the child is expelled from the system. And then looking at specifically at some preschool expulsion data on a national level. As we noted earlier in 2005, Walter Gilliam of the Yale's Child Study Center published a study about preschool expulsion being a national issue that we need to address. And his study found that preschool expulsions rates were at about 6.7 per 1,000 students, which is a rate that's 3 times higher than the rates in K-12 education. There were subsequent state studies, which Sarah D. mentioned a little bit earlier, including in Colorado, that found similar or higher rates. So in Colorado, we found rates of 10 per 1,000 students, and we found that those rates were higher in childcare, licensed childcare homes. So we found a rate in 2006 of 35 students per 1,000 students compared to 6.4 per 1,000 in center-based programs. We would note that Colorado's early childhood and education rate of expulsions did drop between 2006 and 2011, which is a positive step.
At this point, do we know of any data around how many of the children that we're talking about now have access to early childhood mental health consultation or those types of resources, or is it hard to overlap that data?
Great question. Yeah, that's a great question. We have data for children in Colorado who have access to those services, but in terms of whether we can compare those children who were expelled from preschool and have access to those services, I don't know that we have been able to compare those two data sets.
Not on a lot. So this is Sarah D. So in both the 2006 and the 2011 studies that we did, and I just want to reinforce that those were just point-in-time studies. We don't have an ongoing mechanism for collecting this kind of data, so it's difficult to compare with just sort of 2 points in time. But we did ask the question in those 2 studies of whether they had access to somebody who was sort of acting as a mental health consultant. And particularly, so the access to an early childhood mental health consultant, and we sort of defined that because we weren't sure people knew what that meant. The access did help in the likelihood of expulsions. Where it actually made a really significant difference was in family child care homes. Family child care homes had a very significant, the likelihood was much less if they had access to somebody who could serve as a mental health consultant with them. So I think that sort of reinforced that the family child care homes probably have fewer resources and sort of a fewer network, less of a network of support and peer resources available to them. So having that person who could serve as a mental health consultant made a significant difference to those family child care providers.
Thanks.
All right, so now we want to take a look at some data that is specific to Colorado. And just to give a little bit of context for this data, in December, we made a formal data request to CDE for data at grade level in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade for out-of-school suspensions in Colorado. And we found that 2014 and 15 school year was the first year that this data was collected by grade level in Colorado. So the data that we are looking at is data from 1 year, from the 2014-15 school year. We did want to acknowledge that we had a stakeholder meeting on Friday about the data. We brought together a diverse group of stakeholders to talk about it. And a few school districts questioned whether the CDE data that we received from our request was accurate. And those districts have reached out to CDE about what they feel are some differences between the data that they've reported to the state and then the data that we received in our formal data request. So we've taken that under advisement, and we're monitoring that to find out what CDE uncovers as they work with these districts. But I did just want to acknowledge that point before we dig into this data. So when we looked at the data for Colorado, we saw, first of all, a few places where data is lacking that I just want to point out. So first of all, we don't have any quality data in Colorado on preschool suspensions and expulsions. So this data that we're looking at is only for kindergarten through 3rd grade, and that's because we really don't have good data in Colorado right now on preschool suspensions and expulsions, and that's a place where we need better data. We also in Colorado don't have data at any grade level, including for K through 3rd grade, that's disaggregated by family economic status. So we're not able to look at the rate of suspensions and expulsions for children based on their free and reduced price lunch status, which would also be helpful data to have. That being said, for the data that we do have, the trends are concerning. So we can see here, for example, this first slide, that boys in kindergarten through 3rd grade are much more likely to be suspended out of school than girls. So in kindergarten, for example, boys are more than 4 times as likely to be suspended out of school as girls. And just an additional note on this data shows the number of total out-of-school suspensions in Colorado in 2014-15. So it's not per student, it's per incident. So this could include a student who is suspended out of school on more than one occasion, and both of those incidents would be included in this data. So I just wanted to point that out as a clarifying point. Then when we start to, again, overlay the race and ethnicity lens over gender, we see some concerning trends as well. So in kindergarten through 3rd grade, African American boys in Colorado are suspended out of school at a rate 5 times higher than their pupil enrollment would predict. And we know that emerging research has demonstrated that student suspension rates are having an outsized impact on their reading and math achievement. In the K-12 system at large, school suspensions account for almost 1/5 of the black-white differences in school performance, and it's likely that the impact of these disciplinary practices early in an academic career could be even more dramatic. We also see some disproportionality when we look at special education children in K through 3rd grade in Colorado. We see that these students are suspended out of school at a rate that's more than triple what their pupil enrollment would predict. And then lastly, this slide shows the total number of students per 1,000 students who are suspended out of school at least once in Colorado. So the state average is the red line that goes across the graph, and it's about 14 students per 1,000 students who are suspended out of school at least once in Colorado during the 2014-15 school year. And then if you go across the graph, you can see how these different groups of students average, match up to that average. So for example, if we look at the end of the graph at African American boys in Colorado, we see that 42.77 African American boys per 1,000 per 1,000 children received at least one out-of-school suspension in Colorado in 2014-15 in K through 3rd grade.
And this is Sarah D. I just want to emphasize that if you look at the highest columns, those are African American boys and children on IEPs.
Yep.
So I think those,
as well as African American children
went on IEPs. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we sort of think about those two very highly disproportionate groups of students, the children with disabilities and African American boys.
One question that came up around does CDE actually differentiate the cause of different suspensions for each case? Is it, whether it's fighting or biting or something else?
So it's a great question. We have that information at the school level, so not by grade level. And what we've seen from that data is that I believe the top 3 reasons for out-of-school suspensions are defiance, disruptive behavior, I believe is the other one, and then the third category is other. And so it doesn't tell us a lot about, at the particular grade level, why each student was suspended out of school.
So I think even sort of knowing that just defiance is one of those is a consideration that we should think about, because especially with very young children, when they're sort of still testing and trying to figure out sort of what happens if I did this kind of behavior. So I think we need to really think about that defiance category of purpose for expulsion or suspension, and whether that sort of really it really makes sense for a 5-year-old to be suspended because of defiance. So we want to just talk a little bit about some of the factors of early learning programs that we know are associated with increased likelihood of expulsion or suspension. So some of these variables are class size, sort of student-teacher ratios, the length of time that children are in the classroom. If children are in classrooms for longer amounts of time, there tend to be higher rates of suspension or expulsion, and that's nationally. We don't know that specifically here in Colorado. An exception to the ratio and class size variable is actually in family child care homes. So typically they have much smaller, they're much smaller in size and in ratios. But in our Colorado study, we had significantly higher rates of expulsion in family child care homes. So that's an interesting data point that that's one place where sort of there's a discrepancy in that sort of the ratio is not as predictive of low expulsions. Process variables are also important, such as child-teacher interaction, sort of how teachers and children are working together and how teachers work together to support each other around sort of what happens in their classroom. And also teacher beliefs about discipline. Those are also influential in increasing the likelihood of expulsions. National studies show that if teachers believe more that discipline, harsh discipline practices change behavior, then those are classrooms where there's more likely to be an expulsion or a suspension. And just a note on that, and I know I keep mentioning the boring research, but I like it. But we also know that there's no evidence. There's just no, nationally and state by state, there's no evidence that shows that suspensions or expulsions actually change behaviors. What they do is they just remove the child from school, and those children typically come back to school if they come back from suspensions, and don't have behaviors to replace the behaviors that got them suspended in the first place. So what can work? If you look through sort of all of what's out there, all of the good stuff that's working, and sort of filter through what do we know works and what do we want to do more of, particularly here in Colorado, there are 4 key elements that we know can truly mitigate the circumstances that lead to these exclusionary discipline practices, suspension and expulsion in early childhood settings or early learning settings, and in K2 as well, K through 2. So while these are listed separately, all 4 of these things that we know work really should be sort of working synergistically together. So it's not that any one of these is going to make a huge difference. All of these together will make an extremely significant difference. So first, looking at widespread acceptance and availability of preventative strategies. So ensuring that caregivers can learn and practice preventative strategies and build these kinds of preventative strategies into, particularly for children with disabilities who have IEPs or individualized education programs, building preventive strategies into kids with disabilities IEPs, as opposed to building in harsh discipline practices into kids' IEPs, like restraint. Like there have been some IEPs that include restraint as a strategy in the IEP. So I think if we look more, particularly because we saw the disproportionality of kids on IEPs, at building preventative strategies into everything that happens for all children, that can work.
And on that note, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. We did have a question I was going to wait for later, but on the IEP subject, somebody said that they were told that children with IEPs were not, or individualized education programs, were not able to be suspended or were expelled from their school.
So there's, I think people get confused about that. So if any student, whether or not they're on an IEP, if it's a less than 10-day suspension, then that student is subject to discipline practices just as any other student would be. If a student who has an IEP, if it's more than a 10-day suspension, or if it's a cumulative amount of days of suspension that's more than 10 days through the school year, then there does need to be a manifestation determination, which is the determination of whether the behavior that caused the suspension or the expulsion was, well, suspension, because expulsion is actually a little bit different, that whether the behavior was caused because of a result of the student's disability. So there has to be a manifestation determination to determine whether the cause was related to the disability. But if it's less than 10 days, children who have IEPs or have identified disabilities who are covered under IDEA can have the same kinds of suspension for the same kinds of reasons as any other child can. So it's that 10-day cutoff. So the second thing that we know can work is intervention strategies that teach and not punish. We're not trying to say that difficult things don't happen in classrooms and that really challenging situations don't occur. But if we have intervention strategies that aren't sort of purely punitive and sort of harshly disciplinary, we know those work a lot better at preventing that kind of behavior from happening again. So if we can use more intervention strategies that help children calm down, to sort of help children to sort of understand their consequences of their behavior, but not in a way that's going to remove them from a situation where they can learn those things, we have much better, those kids have much better opportunities to actually change their behavior. Program and state policies that reflect principles of positive behavior support, inclusion, and limiting suspension and expulsion. Sarah B. will talk a little bit more about what some other states have done and what sort of where some thoughts are in Colorado. And then early childhood mental health consultation. Somebody asked a question earlier about whether we know sort of how mental health consultation relates to suspensions and expulsions. Early childhood mental health consultation has emerging very solid evidence that it can help to prevent school expulsions, that schools who have access to an early learning environment, that have access to an early childhood mental health consultant, or in Colorado we also have early childhood mental health specialists that serve that function, that really can be a very effective strategy in helping to mitigate suspensions and expulsions. So just quickly, I want to run through sort of a little bit of detail in each of those 4 areas that we know work. So preventative strategies, if we have curricula and frameworks that build relationships, enhance environments, teach self-regulation, if we do those early on with all children, then we're more likely to have fewer children that get to sort of that their behaviors escalate to a level where we need to have these sort of more disruptive kinds of discipline practices. Having a general understanding of child development, child behavior, and the importance of social emotional development. I think we're really getting there. I think there's a lot happening in professional development in Colorado that really is emphasizing the importance of understanding child development and children's social emotional development. And then also healthy caregivers and teachers. If we don't have a healthy workforce, it's going to be really hard for that workforce to support young children in their care in healthy ways. So we need to do just as much to support healthy caregivers and healthy teachers. And also looking at non-punitive intervention strategies. As I said, we're not saying that you know, situations won't escalate. So there may be some some really challenging situations that happen where there's some behavioral issues that really need to be addressed and intervene. We can't, as much as we do and all the good preventative strategies, we may still have some of those sort of escalating behaviors. So if we continue to use punitive strategies such as timeout or negative consequences alone, there's no evidence that shows those kind of strategies actually help children change their behavior, help children learn different behaviors or substitute behaviors. Another question we need to ask is if we're imposing discipline on chronically misbehaving children as though they don't want to behave, whereas in many cases they simply don't know how. The goal of an intervention should be to get to the root of the problem and not to discipline a child for the way his or her brain might be wired. And then program and state policies. On another level of what works, states, municipalities, and early learning programs can and are adopting policies that mitigate and in some cases ban early childhood expulsion. We'll review in the next several slides some examples of how these various policies and decisions are being implemented. So I'll pass it on to Sarah B. to go through some of those other states and municipalities.
So we just wanted to give a few examples of what some other states or municipalities are doing in terms of policy changes around suspensions and expulsions for young children. So one example is in Connecticut. Last year, Connecticut passed a law that eliminates expulsions for students in preschool and grades kindergarten through second, so pre-K through second grade. And it allows out-of-school suspensions in those grades only if the student's conduct is of a violent or sexual nature that endangers other people. Another example we see in Washington, D.C., they have the Preschool Student Discipline Amendment Act, and this prohibits the expulsion of preschool students and also prohibits out-of-school suspension of preschool students unless that student has willfully caused or attempted to cause bodily injury or threatened serious bodily injury to another person. It also limits any out-of-school suspensions to 3 days. And then we also see an example in Chicago where suspensions of students in preschool and grades kindergarten through second grade are permitted only if behavior poses an imminent danger, and those suspensions have to be limited to 1 day. And then during that suspension, the principal must develop a plan addressing the safety of the students and the staff that must include strategies for preventing future behavior incidents, restoring relationships, and addressing the students' ongoing social, emotional, and academic needs. So I want to talk just a little bit about what's happening here in Colorado. So in Colorado, our current law makes an inadequate distinction between young children and older children in terms of suspensions and expulsions. So this means that the same standard that might make sense for a 17-year-old in Colorado in a school can also be applied to a 5-year-old under our current law. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, Sarah D., when we think about what we know about children under the age of 8 years old and their stage of development, we know that in many cases this is not an effective method for changing their behavior. We also know that it has dramatic impacts on their health and school success. Suspension or expulsion from school for what are often developmentally appropriate, although perhaps challenging behaviors, it really does little to address the needs of children that are exhibiting these behaviors. We also know that research shows that when young students are suspended or expelled from school, they're several times more likely to experience discipline later in life. So this includes dropping or failing out of high school or being suspended or expelled later in their academic career. They also report feeling disconnected from school and also are more likely to be incarcerated later in life. These early childhood and early elementary exclusionary practices have been referred to as the point of entry to the school to prison pipeline. So we have been working with a number of partners, including Padres y Jóvenes Unidos and a number of other key partners that came together to work on a proposal to address the issue of out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for young children under the age of 8 in Colorado. And we're working on a proposal to limit suspensions and expulsions for these children in preschool through second grade, and also to address the disproportionality issues through some better data collection around these issues. We have received some significant pushback on this proposal from stakeholders, and so we are currently evaluating what to pursue in this area based on some of the feedback we've received. We do know that as of this month, we have in Colorado some new revised licensed child care center rules. And those rules, which are the product of about 5 years of work among various health and early childhood advocates, as well as providers and state and local agencies and policymakers, does include some provisions around social emotional health and development of young children, as well as suspensions and expulsions in the licensed child care setting. So the new revised rules include elevating expectations for positive behavioral strategies that can support children's social emotional health. And this includes individualized supports that can address some of these challenging behaviors that too often lead to suspensions and expulsions, and also promoting access to mental health consultation. Licensed child care centers will also need to take and document steps prior to suspending and expelling children in their care, and also ensure that annual staff professional development includes training in social emotional development of young children.
So early childhood mental health consultation, mentioned this before, but just digging a little bit more into what that might look like in Colorado. So we know that more than 10 years of increasingly rigorous studies on early childhood mental health consultation has shown that it can reduce the risk for expulsion. And more in Colorado, with the Office of Early Childhood and other stakeholders have been looking at how early childhood mental health consultation can really be better built into our early childhood system as a sustainable support to help, particularly to help mitigate suspensions and expulsions, but also to generally help as a capacity building strategy for teachers and other caregivers to have those tools in their toolbox to be more preventative and to really sort of feel comfortable and confident in mitigating and addressing challenging behaviors.
So currently in Colorado, we have a total of 17 early childhood mental health specialists that can support the more than 400,000 children under the age of 6 living in Colorado. So what this means is that, not surprisingly, these existing specialists can only respond to a fraction of the referrals that they receive. The good news is the Colorado Department of Human Services has a supplemental budget request that would double the number of early childhood mental health specialists in Colorado using federal funding. This supplemental request was unanimously approved by the Joint Budget Committee, and it's included in House Bill 1242, which is the CDHS Supplemental Appropriations Bill. So we're excited to see that request moving forward.
So what's needed? So I know we've got about 10 minutes remaining. We want to make sure we've got time for questions. So I'm just going to go through these, and maybe this can sort of help spark some of your questions and also just sort of some food for thought to think about as we move forward from this conversation. So the first thing is we need to really figure out the type, the frequency, and the mechanism for ongoing data collection. As I mentioned, we did 2 point-in-time studies for early care and education that really sort of there's not a sustainable way to continue to collect that kind of data for early learning, so it's not public preschool or kindergarten through 2, but the early learning, so private preschool. Early care and education programs. So we need a system that can be built so it can inform practice. If we don't know the extent to which suspension and expulsion are occurring and the disparities that are resulting, it's going to be really hard to try and find solutions. So as I mentioned earlier, mental health consultation, the second thing that's needed, we need a more sustainable early childhood mental health consultation capacity and infrastructure. We have great things happening in our state, and we're a leader in some ways around our state's investment in our early childhood mental health specialists. However, we need a more sustainable way to have an infrastructure to support those folks and to support the other people in our state who are doing mental health consultation, so that there's some consistency in practice and an understanding of accessibility and how those consultants can be paid for. The workforce, we need a strong and relevant workforce preparation program and professional learning opportunities. The next one about best and evidence-based practices also relates to workforce development, but is worth calling out specifically to emphasize that we need to intentionally support children's emotional and social development. And when challenging behavior does appear, we need to make sure that the people who are in classrooms with children feel that they're confident and have the tools they need so that they can provide safe ways for children to help children with their behavior, for it to evolve into behavior that serves its purpose in more effective ways. And lastly, but significantly, are policies that are needed at various levels to promote inclusion, and at the very least discourage exclusionary practices, including suspension and expulsion of young children. These should be policies at the state, local, program level. Examples that are such as the language that are used in our Colorado child care rules, and hopefully programs will feel comfortable instead of developing their own language that they can help parents understand what their own practices are in their early learning centers and programs. So we wanted to give you some resources and some of the publications that we had mentioned. So I believe because these are going to be posted, that you'll be able to just click on these links. So just an idea of some of the tools that we were referencing and reports that we were referencing coming from the Administration on Children and Families, the Walter Gilliam report, the Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights data collection. So there's some really good information that you could pull down from these sites that I would encourage you to do. And we would be very happy to, I'm speaking for the Sarahs here, although feel free to jump in, Sarah B. So we'd be happy to field questions both here, but also getting in touch with us directly. We would love to talk. We love talking this stuff. I certainly am really invested and immersed in it, and would really be happy to talk about sort of thoughts or concerns, or as people sort of move forward in their work ahead. Great.
I did just want to do a quick follow-up on a question that came up a little earlier about the reasons for out-of-school suspensions, just to give a little more concrete answer to that question. I said earlier we don't collect that data, or CDE does not collect that data by grade level, but the top 3 reasons are detrimental behavior, defiance, and other. So those are the 3 categories, the top 3 categories for reasons for out-of-school suspensions in elementary school. That's as close down as we can get the data.
Cool. And we do have a few minutes for questions. I have some really good ones. So, so the first one is a kind of concern and issue from a child care owner that I think is probably not limited to just this person. Thinking about using suspensions and expulsions only as a last resort, but continuing to feel like they struggle continuously working with parents to get them access to a physician, counselor, or some sort of other evaluation, but not getting any movement from parents, and feeling like sometimes the only way to get a parent to react or respond is to suspend or expel a student. So any thoughts on that, or resources that might be good for child care providers?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. I hear you. And I think that Hannah's right. That's probably not a common feeling or a common situation to be in. I would say that there are a lot of really good resources and tools, many of them free, out there to do things like sort of help set up classrooms so that they encourage sort of children to interact sort of differently with each other, so that sort of it creates sort of a more social environment that doesn't create as many sort of conflicts and behaviors. So there are some great tools out there just for how to set up classrooms, and some de-escalating strategies too. That if environments can have some plans in place for how transitions happen. Sometimes transition time is a really difficult time, or if kids aren't quite sure what's going to happen next, that might sort of things might become a little more chaotic. So, so I would suggest maybe a couple of things. One is just sort of some of these hands-on free resources put out by some very good organizations. There's if you go to challengingbehavior.org, there are some great downloadable resources, including what's called a backpack series, which are these little one-pagers that teachers can use to talk about children's behavior and put in the backpack and send home, so that the parents and the teachers are kind of talking about things in the same way and helping to address things in the same way. I think the other part of that question is, who do you turn to and where do you refer people? And I think that's a little more difficult question, because right now we don't have all the resources we need for early childhood mental health in Colorado.
Great. Thanks to Jennifer Barnes for that question. And then we have a question from Ann Shimke that's directed more towards Sarah B. The basis for the pushback for the proposed policy changes that you were talking about. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Or
Sure. That's a good question. My sense is that a lot of the pushback comes from the feeling that schools and districts need to have access to all available options when they're deciding what to do in a particular situation, and that those schools feel as though they do need to be able to use out-of-school suspension or expulsion when they feel like it's appropriate to do that, rather than have that option be limited to them, even though they do feel like they use it as rarely as they can. They feel like they still need to have that option available to them if that's what they feel is necessary in a situation. I think that's where a lot of the pushback comes from. And then in addition to that, it gets to the question that we just talked about and some of our earlier conversation around resources and feeling like there's a lack of resources and support for schools to deal with situations in a way that would still be possible if suspensions and expulsions were limited to them as an option.
And I just want to just real quickly, because I know we're coming down to time, but just add that as an example of how, you know, the concern is real, and I think it's very understandable that schools want to have this sort of the tool in the toolbox. If you look at sort of what happened in Montgomery County, Virginia, they eliminated suspensions in young children. They haven't had any suspensions of young children. I don't remember when they passed it. What they've done instead is they've, particularly for kids who are on IEPs, they've gotten these very, very detailed strategies built into their individual educational programs that really sort of outline de-escalation strategies. And they, and actually I was just talking to somebody this morning who let me know that the person who was working in that district, who was sort of trying to figure out what these strategies can be if they can't suspend or expel young kids anymore, she now is working to try and get this across the state of Virginia. She was in the school district, and she's now working to sort of push for this across the state because it worked so well for them in Montgomery County, Virginia.
Interesting. I think we just have one more minute, so one more question, a super important question, I think, in relation to seeing the high percentages and high disparities between African American boys being suspended and expelled. What specifically are some ideas that you have of what's needed there and the conversations that need to be had there? Any thoughts, especially with the racial disparities?
So the question is sort of what do we do?
Yeah, well, you know, how can we expand cultural diversity trainings and things like that?
Well, I mean, I think everybody should meet Rosemary Allen. If you haven't yet, go find her. But I also think that it sort of really comes down to sort of what's being called implicit bias, and that you know, there are things that we all do, that I do, that I think we don't realize we do, that has an impact on children, and sometimes that happens by race or ethnicity. And so I think if we can acknowledge that this thing called implicit bias is there, and get over that, you know, I probably make decisions about things that I don't realize are perhaps biased, then we can move forward to really try and then address what we can do about some of those things, whether it comes from fear, whether it comes from not knowing, or just sort of a misunderstanding. Maybe sometimes it's cultural misunderstanding, but I think if we sort of understand and acknowledge that it's there, and then really try and work to sort of figure out how we can help ourselves to treat all children equally. I mean, what we do know is that for the same kinds of behaviors, African American boys are being suspended for those behaviors. The exact same kind of behavior in a Caucasian boy is not causing a suspension. So that, I think, is a sort of a more clear example of the kinds of bias that we're seeing in how expulsions and suspensions are happening.
Great, and there's a couple other questions, but I think if people are willing to share those via maybe email with both Sarahs or with us, we can maybe follow up with you for sure. We'll have to let everybody go so we can get everybody on with their day. But we wanted to make sure that everybody does know in the follow-up email, we'll make sure, again, this is always recorded, these Lunch and Learn, so a recording will be included along with the PowerPoint slides. And because this particular Lunch and Learn warranted so much interest from partners from the partnership, we're going to plan on hosting a in-person kind of conversation to dive deeper and hear what partners want to learn more about, resources that are needed, and where the partnership can be a space and place to continue those conversations and connect people. So in the follow-up kind of evaluation, SurveyMonkey evaluation, we'll kind of pull some different times so we can see if it's during the regular workday that works best for people, or knowing a lot of people are working with children and families during the day and might need to get an evening time. We're going to test that out for the first time and see what is the need for people. So make sure you fill out that evaluation when we follow up. Thanks so much to the two Sarahs for joining us, and this was a great conversation and great questions from people listening in. So thanks again, and we'll be following up soon.